Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, between two rivers. This is The Uncommon Good on Iowa Catholic Radio. I am Bo Bonner, host of the Catholic Morning Show, but co-host of this illustrious, gainful, resplendent podcast of 8 years. Bud, who are you?
These days, I'm working down at Mercy College of Health Sciences, where 235 West meets 6th Avenue, and
Nice.
helping to train the future healthcare professionals of America, at least Iowa. And the coast.
That's right. You know what's insane is, speaking of confluence of rivers and confluence of highways, there has been so much traffic because of various things. The boys' basketball, the girls' basketball tournament, the wrestling tournament. I'm just trying to paint a scene here like an NPR thing. Can you do background noises? Here we are at Iowa. Anyway, the point being is the few times I've had to run downtown over by where you are gainfully employed, there's a lot of traffic. And this is that fun time of year where people drive the wrong way down one-way roads. So I was wondering if you've had any fun encounters of the driving down the wrong way road kind.
Oh, yeah, there were a few this week. I mean, I work right down there by the event center, so I saw some of that. You know, the cultural life of the city definitely has an influence on traffic. And I was thinking about this actually this week. When I first moved to Des Moines, what's the road that starts with a K down by school? Is it Keogh Way?
Yes.
Yeah,
Keosauqua.
when I used to, when we first moved here and I was commuting to work, that would often be backed up all the way to the interstate. Mm-hmm. But since COVID, it's never gotten that volume where I don't think I ever I used to have to scooch to the middle lane because if I was in the far right lane, it could get kind of dangerous. But this week I even noticed, so you're right, it did increase volume kind of around the event center. But I think this was spring break for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because the drives were very easy for me this week.
Yes, I think it was spring break, and that was a traveling mercy, pun intended. But yeah, I mean, it was wrestling, it was basketball. It is that time of year, the Big 12 basketball tournament wrapping up. I mean, all the other conference tournaments too, if you're a Big 10 or SEC fan. But yeah, so the weather's turning warmer. People are finishing the spring sports. And then, so then traffic goes by. But we're old men. We just talked 2.5 straight minutes about the traffic as an introduction to our show. Does that mean we belong in a retirement home?
I'm not ready for that yet.
But we're trying hard.
Yeah, and once you mentioned basketball, the Huskers really flamed out. That was disappointing. I try to make it a point to make it to the state basketball tournament. It's a fun time. But I didn't this year. And things were busy. Like each evening had something.
I know. We're just singing about like the nostalgic past when we had time to kill to go watch basketball games. What do we always have time for, Bud? Well, the Uncommon Good, rolling along with our series on technology. First of all, folks, we had the spring fundraiser, which we had the Supercut episode. That was a lot of fun. But then last week, I happened to be sick part of the week, so sorry that we had a replay, but thank you for staying steady and getting ready to jump back into it. But what we have for the people today is next weekend. So we wanted to preview what we're doing next weekend. In case you still have not made plans for the upcoming week, the Benedictine Conference, and I forget, what is it exactly called? Do you remember?
The Symposium on Transforming Culture.
That's great. It's in Atchinson, Kansas at Benedictine College. We have now done this. Is this like the 7th time? 6th time?
It's crazy.
And so we're keeping up the tradition. And what we're talking about is going to be about technology. So this works. The theme for the Benedictine Conference is about the importance of marriage as the sacrament, as an institution, matrimony. So we're going to talk about difficulties in marriage, matchmaking, things like this because of the digital world. And so we're not going to preview our talks because then you wouldn't need to go. But we'll talk about some background information that would inform why we're talking about what we're going to talk about. And first of all, Bud, it actually always helps us out. It gets the old brain juices flowing. So next week when we give the talk, it helps. But hopefully this gives a preview. And if you've not made any plans for next week, make sure to head on down to Atchinson, Kansas, and see us and many people talking about marriage and its importance for the church. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Bud, we have said, and we meant it, and we were not lying. We now have a tradition of making an appearance at the Benedictine Conference. What was its full name again?
The Symposium on Transforming Culture.
So this always happens in March. It's down in Atchinson, Kansas. We've been doing it for a while. Various people we know have joined us from Des Moines, and we get to see friends again. It is always a good time, and it's a reasonable drive. It's not too hard to get down there. So hopefully today we'll give the groundwork for what we're going to talk about. Maybe that will entice you to come down, hear our full talks, and then what other people are up to. So, Bud, series on technology, the theme for the Benedictine Conference on marriage. So we wanted to talk about how life in the digital age, and particularly the sort of technological advances and their sort of social impact, have impacted marriage itself. As is standard for the you and me 1-2 punch, I think your talk is aimed at talking about the groundwork, the general idea, the map, as it were, of where we're sitting when talking about what's going on in our age and how that affects this long-established idea of marriage. Mine, of course, is kooky and trying to diagnose and make people think about this sort of turned on its head. That's sort of the Bo Bud experience, especially people who know and listen know that on the radio show, but it's particularly the case when we give talks. So without ruining your talk, Bud, what are sort of the foundations of what you want to talk about and why this topic, as it were, what's sticking in your craw about it?
Well, on the show, we've talked a lot the last couple of years about how the introduction of new technologies changes the very framework of the world in which we operate. And you think about culture as kind of an ecosystem. So when you add a technology, as it were, when something advances in a certain way, it's not simply that you have the same culture and there's this new tool inside of that same culture. It's that the ground actually shifts in some way. We've belabored this point with something like the printing press. So with my talk, thinking specifically about the sacrament of marriage or the institute of marriage in the modern world, you can really trace this back in a lot of ways to the introduction of like widespread, affordable contraception. When you think about the contraception as a technology, as sort of like an advanced instrument that has changed human practice, like as Catholics, we sometimes have this mentality of like, well, it's one of the church's no's. Like, it's just not something we're supposed to do. And people wrestle with this in their marriages, like it's off, like probably something in the confessional and things like that. But what I want to focus on in my paper is that how much that just transformed the ecosystem and the way that we think about relationships, where, like we use the term these days, like recreational sex, or there's a real, there's almost like an epidemic of an inability to like practice fidelity or to care for the children who might be conceived or whatnot. And so I think before getting to the digital age, I kind of want to trace back to that huge shift, but it's all kind of related. And in the back of my mind, as I've been like working through these things, I've been thinking about, I'm probably going to mispronounce the name, but Zygmunt Bauman, he talked about liquid modernity, how modern or postmodern culture, it's characterized by instability, by sort of like a kind of loneliness. And whenever you start talking about that, you can't help but also think of Marx and the way that like modern markets kind of dissolve what used to be solid. And so I know that I'm painting with very like broad strokes there, but those are kind of like the ingredients of my recipe.
Well, I think that it's what's interesting, what you're pointing out, that we can never beleaguer it too much. It's easy to get caught up in the content, as it were, of the arguments for contraception on both sides.
Yeah.
So we'll go, for the liberal wing that's for, and I don't mean that in like liberal conservative, I mean liberal enlightenment. So if we make conventions that give people freedom or give them control of their destiny, all of those sort of talks, that's the content of the argument. And then the arguments against it, the content of them are, well, what about tradition? What about fidelity? What about the end or goal of why we do things? And in some ways, right, where those arguments are and what they are, they're rather well rehearsed. I don't even necessarily think it's, there's people who don't know it, and so it's always important for Christians to witness to the reality of the faith. But as far as is there some aspect of the argument that's sort of unstated content-wise? I don't think so. I think the sides kind of know where they sit. What's interesting is the context, not only for why those arguments got made, which is a sort of historical context shift that you've already brought up, but how they shift the way the context going forward goes. And so when people start to, before contraception, the technological advancements of the modern age, there were contraceptions. They didn't have a great success rate, even compared to modern ones. They were often lethal or dangerous or problematic to find or, all of these things. But certainly it was the case that the default was, if you have sex, you have to think it's possible to have children. Like, that's the default. Yeah. Everything else was an argument about, am I going to contracept? Am I not going to get married? Am I going to be celibate? Right? Okay, but the default, you'll get married, you'll have sex, you'll have kids. That's how the human race goes forward. The context now, technologically, is the assumption is you don't have to have kids and you choose to have them. Mm-hmm. But just that shift, and I know I hope I'm not stealing your thunder, but I think this is where you're getting at. That shift is beyond monumental to go, the assumption is if you perform the sexual act, a child is likely to come to it, to the shift of the sexual act has to be positively chosen to be open to life. That has massive social ramifications, and that's just the beginning of all of this.
Yeah, and in the face of all these things, it's hard not to feel kind of pessimistic about, the symposium it's called Transforming Culture. But when you think about how arguments about these matters are sustained across time, a writer like Alistair McIntyre, who taught for many years at Notre Dame, he talks about incommensurate traditions, like traditions whose first principles are so different that it's hard to even have any common ground, like any sort of traction to the conversation. And I think we can sense that as Catholics in today's society. And that's where I struggle with this. Like, I do think there's a place for apologetics. I've learned a lot from listening to like Catholic radio shows that are in that vein. But I think when it comes to marriage and the family right now, the witness has to be incarnational. And I'm using that, like, it is gesturing, of course, to the incarnation. But like Charles Taylor, another philosopher, he talks about the reality of excarnation, like how our culture kind of prizes the mind and the body just becomes like a vehicle for ideas, And so the countercultural witness of Catholics, it has to be enfleshed. And I don't know, like, I don't think we're going to be able to like reason our way out of this one. Mm-hmm. And that's where when St. Paul talks about marriage being as like a sacrament or like a mystery that shines forth, that makes manifest Christ's love for the church, it begins there. And that, to me, in my research, it's ironic that at the same time, like nuptial theology, like Balthasar and Ratzinger were writing so much, like using
that's very interesting.
Marriage as an analogy for different theological ideas. You almost saw like the collapse of the practice of marriage.
No, that's very interesting. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that there is no going back at all. So this is where I think it's akin to the arguments we've been railing on about communication. So, we've made this point that even if you in the digital world decide not to use digital apparati, you can't help but live in a world deeply formed by the digital. And even if all of the computers shut off, even if we went off the grid, even our sort of forms of talking and thinking have been deeply formed by the digital, and you can't go back. I mean, Bud, this is, I think, one of the things that Catholics need to have levity about and be honest. There is no going back, at least in the foreseeable future, but maybe at all, where the assumption is if you have sex, it's likely the default is to have a child. Mm-hmm. So even when we get on the defensive about this, like you were saying, so we want to transform culture, the fact we think we need to transform culture is now a choice you positively make. So, I mean, what would it even look like, Bud, to return to a world where the assumption, the unspoken assumption is sex is for procreation and not something that has to be argued for at the top of the mind before any, because you're right, like the witness is not going to be rationality. You're right. We're not going to reason ourselves out of this one, but we can't not think about it.
Yeah.
Right? Like in order for it to be sort of the warp and weft of a Catholic tradition that like we're just by our witness going to show our openness to children. But you know, I have 5 kids, you have 8, right? You haven't snuck one in that I don't know about, right?
That's what I remember.
Yeah. So we're weirdos, and our spouses and ourselves and the people that we know, this was all a conscious decision. We're like, we are going to be countercultural and do this. Dude, before contraception, 5 kids, 8 kids, that was not like, it's not that like, oh, they just did whatever they were told or that they had no freedom or the church didn't allow. No, it's just that was the background assumption technologically, biologically. And I don't think you can return to that. And so if the church is trying to reach a golden age or an Eden that can't get back to, I think that hamstrings us in this witness that we need to be very intentional about, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Well, and this is where I'm almost going to like steal an idea or repurpose an idea that sometimes Catholics are very allergic to. You know, when you listen to some cultural critics, like more in a leftist vein, they'll talk about intersectionality, the way that certain kinds of like discrimination or, you know, those who are on the margins, they're like, risk factors isn't the right word.
Their difficulties and their
are related. So like you have, you know, like you might be an ethnic minority who, you know, like financially is in a certain place and, you know, like sexuality, all these different identities are kind of like
compounded
tied together.
Things,
yeah. But intersectionality, as I'm thinking about it here, is like you've got the reality that I've been talking about. And then there's this kind of ephemeral nature to a lot of social interactions. So like we've talked about the dangers of the digital. Like there's these great benefits that come to us, but there's also like ways in which there can be kind of like shallow relations or a tendency to withdraw from sort of like day-to-day incarnational encounters and just to encounter people in like brief, shallow ways or whatnot. But I think that's all related to a deeper issue about how we think about the economy, because everything becomes so profit driven, where the primary question is like, what can I make from this? You know, like what just like the profit margin. You know, someone like Karl Marx, he talked about being alienated from the work that we do. So the work isn't oriented to...
Well, even the labor, right? Like you make something and then like you put yourself into it and then you have to go market yourself.
Yeah. And those trends are really hard to resist. Like most of our labor these days is not oriented to creating something that's good, right? And it's just hard to kind of like get by day to day without falling into these habits. Well, I think those habits have influenced the way that we navigate relationships as well. And you think about practices like, well, practices is probably a poor word, but phenomena like Tinder or something like this, right? Where
I think they're a practice.
Yeah.
I know what you're saying. Like we worry about that. We don't want to solely the word practice, but it is definitively a discipline.
Yeah.
It's just a bad one.
And so, that's where the kind of discipleship that we want to provide for our young people, it's going to require asking certain sacrifices of them because you have to be recalibrated, as it were.
Yeah. And I mean, that is something that obviously the church in her storehouse of tradition will always have things both old and new to bring out. So I'm not saying like we're orphans left without, you know, direction. It's definitively going to have to be put in new ways.
Yeah.
That to me is what, so, you know, rebelling against God in and through our sexuality is as old as Adam and Eve. So, you know, there's nothing new under the sun. How it shows up and the context that it's sort of made, I do think that we're not going to be able to copy and paste old arguments about sexuality into this one. Which is not to say that we need a new sexual ethic. I'm not saying anything of that at all. Yeah. We don't need to reimagine marriage. I go back to there's assumptions you could have had even if you were evangelizing pagans that you can no longer assume. And to everything you're saying, this is going to make the witness of Christian discipline, I don't want to say that it's going to have to be more intentional or more conscious. That makes it sound like we're, you know, bold superheroes in a new age. But it's just sort of the fact of the material conditions. Yeah. It really is. It's not even a sort of intellectual or spiritual things uniquely, all things are spiritual first, I'm not denying that, but the material conditions, you can mean to be a good Catholic boy or girl wanting to, like, the vocation of matrimony, that's what you feel called to, and it's going to take a sort of direct intentionality that it simply didn't 400 years ago, 300 years ago, probably 50 years ago.
Well, to me, this harkens back to that interview that we did with Holly Taylor Kuhlman, where to reimagine marriage, you almost have to reimagine communal life and fiscal responsibility. And it requires a certain level of gratuity on the part of households. And that's why I love the fact that the word economy is rooted in the idea of household, because if we call young people to a radical way of life when it comes to marriage and the family, there also has to be like this entire sort of network that exists. I don't say that meaning like, well, if you have a moral failure, it's just like your circumstances around you that led to that. But it's like they're all, and that's where I was using the term intersectionality. Like they're all tied together, and you can't really like live like a modern capitalist and then try to like track backwards and have like faithful marriages that are open to life.
No, it's going to seem, I mean, you're making a choice. Is you're purchasing a certain sort of marriage. This actually tacks in well with what I'm going to talk about. Are you going to bring up the intersectionality bit in your paper? You really should. This is a good point. Like, you reclaim the word, bud.
I am really repurposing it, like the, you know.
Oh, right. No, it will make all sorts of people mad. That's why I like it. But I think it's accurate. Is there's certainly a time in rational discourse to like make distinctions and break them apart. But I think you're right to talk about the unique problem that maybe we sometimes speak past or simplify too much is these intersections of issues in order to talk about Catholic matrimony in the modern world.
Yeah, and this is where I struggle with the question of, I think it'd be a tough time to be a parish priest. Maybe there's never an easy era to be a priest, but
Baroque. No,
yeah, that's right. You know, when young couples come to you, whether to get married or to baptize their child, I think there is a natural question that's important. Like, will this marriage take on like the kind of shape or character that the church asks for? Mm-hmm. Will these children be raised in the faith? But I think it was Ratzinger himself, like Pope Benedict, you know, never to be confused for like an arch liberal, who said our default, or like we should err on the side of incorporating people into the sacraments.
Yeah, grace.
Yeah, and bring them into that.
But I
think there's some wisdom to that.
I mean, so on one hand, I mean, I'm with you. I'm very much double-minded on this one, because on one hand, the power of grace certainly saved a wretch like me. But on the other hand, you know, it's like you said, like the discipline that a spiritual father is supposed to have. First of all, when we have like 600 families in a parish, it becomes nearly impossible to sort of know anyone close enough to say yay or nay in a very specific way. So if you're going to default, assume, and I mean, I think someone like Adam Story, our good friend who's a canon lawyer, I think the canon law presumes on the side of they have the right to seek a sacrament. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to question the presumption of the law. So they're in a tough spot, because then they have to sort of positively choose to be more restrictive, as it were, than the law, the letter or spirit of the law, for the sake of maybe if I send this, you know, this is the idea, right? If I send this couple away for a year to really think through, do they really mean it before they come back and baptize their child? You can't say it's like, well, the baptism won't stick, right? Or that you have no right to. But in a pastoral way, would you be able to like say, in this case, it's better for them to like say, really wait and think through this? And I mean, I don't know, man, that would be so tough to be the person to try that.
You know, and I've heard stories of couples who were living together prior to marriage. And I think priests have sometimes counseled, like, during your engagement, I actually want you, like, if possible, to live in separate abodes.
Yeah.
If not, to live as, like we use the phrase, live as brother and sister. And I mean, I think there's something powerful to that, like to kind of call people to a new way of life. On the other hand, you know, like I would feel some trepidation that like maybe this ask would end up proving an obstacle to the sacraments. Like they might say, oh, to heck with it. But yeah, it's tough pastorally.
I think that you have quite the ground for a good paper, and people should go down to it. It's called the Transforming the Transforming Culture Catholic Conference.
Symposium on Transforming Culture.
There you go. It's at Benedictine College. It's what March.
Oh no, 22nd is that the big day?
Yes, that's the big day. So this is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Bud, I believe over the break you said you had some complaining at me you wanted to do.
Well, I felt like you almost shined the interrogation light on me during that first session that I talked a lot about what I was thinking about, but so far we haven't got a sneak preview of your own paper.
Okay, that's only fair. So this has really worked out. I've been very impressed by Providence really alley-ooping me multiple times. I've got a chance to give talks that have lined up. You and I, for instance, got to give this wonderful retreat for Knights of Columbus. Man, that was almost a month ago, wasn't it?
Crazy.
And so there I got to talk about ruining your life well and bringing up some of the themes that I usually harp on, but one of them about understanding ourselves and even our spiritual life in utilitarian ways. Then I got the chance to speak out at Lumen Christi. Hat tip to Austin Walker, who is a genius and a scholar and a gentleman. But I got to speak to a bunch of high schoolers. I gave a talk called What Really Happens to Your Soul When You Go Online, and really got into this idea about what it is that the algorithm is, like using that as sort of big term. And so being able to talk about how that sort of life, digital life, significantly changes how people look to pair up with a mate. So I'm thinking of like all the dating apps and all these things like this, or even just the fact that when young people, I mean, it's older too, but primarily young people are thinking about the vocation of marriage and who they might do that with, that they are profoundly altered by what's going on with being online primarily. And that's how that it's overwhelming amount of people who get married meet online now. It is the vast majority of people now. And so from those earlier talks, what I've really come to, and that I have been a mantra that I'm repeating, is that the algorithm is a spiritual discipline. If you want to know what the algorithm is, it's the spiritual discipline of the technocratic paradigm. Technocratic paradigm, if people don't recall, is what Pope Francis in Laudato Si declared as the sort of standing problem of the world right now, is to do things in light of the technocratic paradigm. And my argument is the algorithm is sort of like the perfected, it's not like what started it, but the algorithm is sort of the perfected, boiled down, concentrated spiritual discipline of the technocratic paradigm. Mostly meaning that when you go and you're online long enough, what it spits back out to you and hopes that you do and how it directs you, that it's literally something like a spiritual discipline, that the internet becomes sort of like your spiritual advisor or spiritual director and tries to direct your spirit in a particular way. So, Bud, if what we're talking about is marriage under the regime of the technocratic paradigm, which means the spiritual regime is the algorithm, what does that look like? Like, why is this problematic? In some ways, Bud, let's act like we're all naive here and go, isn't it great, Bud, that now when kids go look for mates online, they can literally click a little thing that goes Christian, bloop, and vanishes the non-Christians. Catholic, bloop, that, it's like, and then you go, oh, it's like choosing a car on CarMax. And that to me is precisely the problem. When people talk about looking for mates, I know I sound like I'm Australian or like, I'm talking about like piranhas choosing each other. But when people are talking about pairing off and finding someone to make a life with, what's the sort of word that they're all looking for? Now, they don't say, oh, I need to find a useful bride or a useful groom. But what they talk about is compatibility. Well, compatibility, and again, I don't want to go too far into this because this will ruin the paper, but I am absolutely frightened by the idea of compatibility for a few reasons. One is compatibility is what we talk about with machines. Machines are compatible with each other. But, I mean, I think there's a lot of problems, but if we say humans are compatible with each other. But this gets down to this one point that I'm going to try to hit off, and I think this is what I'll talk about more today as a background. Even when when people are trying to be as pious as possible, talking about pairing off with a spouse, you'll hear a variation of this where they're like, well, I'm going to choose a spouse that will help get me into heaven. And I know that they have all the best intentions in the world, but that sort of statement is mired with utilitarianism. So the idea is I'm going to find a compatible spouse. Mm-hmm. So that means one that matches my preferences. So, right, I'm already making a purchase or consuming a spouse. Oh, and by the way, the reason I'm marrying them is because they're a good stepping stone to get to heaven. Now, I want to be very careful because, of course, God is above all things. And so I even think the vocation you choose, you should submit that vocation to Christ. So you go, I'm not going to choose any vocation except the one Christ puts in my heart for what he wants for me. I want to do the will of God. And it's even the case, right, with a spouse, that you would submit your choice of who to go through courtship with, to sound ancient, hopefully to the will of God. Yeah. But even if the idea is who you marry, that you should both be the biggest advocates trying to get each other into heaven, that's absolutely true. It is very imperative that you don't think the point of your spouse is to be useful for you to get into heaven. To do that is to ruin the whole kit and caboodle. And I think this compatibility talk actually plays into the utilitarianism of it all. I mean, Bud, you and I, first of all, neither of us got married to a good Catholic girl so that we could get to heaven, primarily because we weren't Catholics at the time. Yeah. And I think there's much more to Providence intervening. Like, if you think that you can sort of boil good Catholic marriages down to a science of who you should pick, and it's these compatibility numbers, I think that's just repeating the technocratic paradigm in Catholic drag. Like, it's not good to do.
There are so many questions going through my mind. Has your research or your preparation gotten into at all? It's funny because I hear like the digital space, and especially social media, is oriented towards superficiality. So we present kind of like the best version of ourselves, not in the Matthew Kelly sort of way, but like we sort of
no comment.
Yeah. We sort of airbrush out all of the infelicities, and like we want to make our life look fun and exciting. And so I hear that sort of thing, but I've also heard testimony from people who got married by meeting online, and they really rave about the fact that like in the old way, you might be more prone to focus on someone's like a physical attractiveness. But like with these dating apps and things, it sort of filters that out, and it actually draws you to people who you're compatible
with. And so this is an interesting thing, man. Like, I have thought a lot about this. I want to talk about those two wise philosophers, Paula Abdul and MC Scat Cat, who had the song Opposites Attract. If people remember, was that late 80s, early 90s?
Wasn't there like an animated cat in the video?
Yeah,
it was really weird.
MC Scat Cat.
Okay.
That's who I'm referring to. We come together because opposites attract, and that one. Yeah. Okay. So I guess you can go like, well, I'm going to put in my compatibility machine, bleep, blorp, bleep, blorp, that opposites attract. But, okay, but opposites attract is true. You and I think, are both beneficiaries of opposites attracting, at least in some ways. Obviously, on the other hand, there's ways that, like, for instance, Robin and I, and then you and Rach are so alike that, like, the opposites are compatible. I actually don't think that's the right word. Complementary. Precisely because there's things that we do agree upon. But I think that if you tried to like break down the alchemy of why I love Robin, she loves me, and it's a good marriage, talking about the compatibility is not going to be the case. In some ways, I think it's like bald face. The stuff where we're not compatible, she just knows how to put up with me in that regard. And so if you're talking also, Bud, if you're talking about getting into heaven and the aspects of marriage that get you into heaven, let's be honest, it's the parts precisely where you're not quote unquote compatible that you're probably actually earning, quote unquote, and I don't mean that, but poetically, earning heaven the most. In some ways, right? Let's be honest about this. Let's talk about this in terms of the most extreme cases. It's not regular. You shouldn't, I'm not trying to tell the kids like go marry like a terrible person, but there's multiple Dostoevsky books about this. There's multiple Catholic books. This is a Graham Greene special that maybe this is what Brideshead Revisited is about. Providence can actually choose you a bad spouse, and that be how both of you get into heaven. So if you're supposedly like out there going around trying to, I'm going to find a useful spouse I can use to get to heaven. I mean, history and literature, Bud, makes it sound like you should choose a crappy spouse, and that like your difficulties and trials are going to be what get you to heaven because of a purgatorial thing, and what get them to heaven because they have to learn to rely on grace. Notice how this starts backfiring really fast. If you think about the sort of great marriages that, you know, people go, oh yeah, that's what got them into heaven. Usually it was one of them was quite the turkey, to say the least, or both of them getting killed by the state.
Yeah.
What you don't get in a lot of saint stories when it involves married people is, oh, they were really compatible and their compatibility got them to heaven. Except for being of the same pure heart when it comes to the faith, that's not what Christian history has lined out as a quote unquote good marriage.
Well, and that's, as you're talking, the one phrase that you use is when we talk about our spouse helping us get to heaven and how that can take on like a utilitarian character to it. I kind of wonder, with the very nature of love, it seems like eros is so important to just the experience of falling in love. And we tend to poo-poo that. Like, it's kind of like, that's seen as like dangerous or potentially like even a near occasion of sin or something. But I wonder if there's almost this way, like in the Catholic world, where we sort of sanitize courtship and the move towards marriage, where it's like it has to be this rational decision. I'm not saying we should be driven by our passions per se, but when you dig into the actual, like when you dig into sacred scripture, eros is also used as imagery for like our love for God.
Yes.
And you know, like being pulled out of yourself. And, you know, I mean, some of the language in the Song of Songs, one of the most commented on books of the Bible in the Middle Ages, and even in the Psalms, has that kind of erotic character. And I worry, you know, marriage just involves a whole lot of sacrifice. And the idea of like bringing children into the world and the blood, sweat, and tears that's involved with that, it's no wonder that God like hardwired us, where it's like when we're young, you know, that draw has to be so strong that we're pulled into marriages.
All right, bud, I was trying to keep all of this secret and not say it till then, but I'll say this. The answer is foolishness, funny enough. The answer to the utilitarian bent of compatibility is foolishness. Now, notice that I didn't say lust, but foolishness. And think about like how often all of the great songs are about being a fool for someone else, including being a fool for God. St. Francis of Assisi, the sort of troubadour, right, of you know, the great poet who in many ways inspired all future romantic movements in the church. He was a fool for Christ, right? He was a fool for Lady Poverty. I think it's important. I mean, think about this with like, you know, Dante. Beatrice, he thinks, saves his soul. A gal he talked to in person twice. He was married to someone else. She died relatively early in his life. But that's sort of like, you're saying the foolishness, the sort of smittenness that he had was this weird inspiration that gets celebrated by many Christians throughout history. Like a very strange case, to say the least. What I'm going to get at here is, that's what I mean by providence is, so God doesn't put the passions in us simply to be suppressed. Right? Like, so Jesus gets angry at the money changer tables. Mm-hmm. And he acts on it. He acts on it rationally. Like, he doesn't go, like, burn the place down. But that anger propels him to overcome the object of difficulty, which is these robbers, these dens of thieves in the house, his father's house. And he overturns the tables and shoos them. Okay. That's why we have love. That's why we have hunger. We have these things, right? Like exactly like you said, that so in times of duress, they will propel us towards some good that would be difficult to good without that strong passion. And so I do think, right, that, you know, total like silly romanticism that's like, well, you can't help who you love. So if you've been married for 20 years and you're smitten by, you know, someone you meet at McDonald's, you should tear down your life. That's not what I'm saying in any way at all. But it is very truly the case that when you're young and you're courting and you're thinking about who to marry, dude, it's not always sort of a rational choice. And I know people will go like, oh, it's lustful, it's just about beauty. But notice that, like, there are people who fall head over in heels love with people that it's not even like their type or like, a perfect 10 or a model or whatever. They won't even be able to explain to you like what about them, the person physically, is what made them a fool for them. It's just time and again, many times have we heard, it was like she was the only girl in the room. He was like the only man talking, right? Mm-hmm. God uses this providence of things that we can't quite see, because the foolishness of providence, of course, but is smarter than any utilitarian calculus or compatibility that we can do.
That's really good. I like this. So, in recent times, there have been biblical scholars who said we should rename the parable of the prodigal son the parable of the prodigal father. Because we say prodigal son because he's like a profligate. He spends his inheritance. He just burns through it or whatever. There's a way in which the father burns through his possessions to honor his son. Yeah. And he kills the fatted calf. He puts on him the finest robe. So there's this kind of prodigality that comes with following Christ. And so many of the parables, like the person who finds the pearl of great price in the field, says like he sells everything that he has and buys the entire field. He doesn't he doesn't make this calculus like, how can I get the pearl and just like extract the pearl? I need the whole kit and caboodle. Yeah. And I think it's that way with marriage. Have you ever seen these crack me up? It's like the Wall Street Journal will run an article about like how much it costs to have a child. Yeah. It's like over the course of his life, this is going to run you. It's something absurd, like $675,000. And you're like, how have I pulled this off? But no, you have to have a certain prodigality to it.
No, it's right. The minute that they put that kid in your hand for the first time, you're like, well, I guess I'll jump into lava for this creature. Right? I mean, like, whatever people talk about, like, I mean, yes, spouses are the natural thing to think about, but no, the foolish head over heels for children. And I mean, this goes back to stuff when we talked about like the sort of calculation with like robots in Will Smith movies, right? Man, who was this? Someone pointed out that it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to send off adult males with jobs to war. Like, what would actually make the most sense is to send teenagers, right? If you're thinking just in cold calculating terms, right? They don't have families yet. They're kind of dumb. Like they get into all this stuff. But of course, every father knows that the greatest injustice of war is a bunch of like 18 to 25-year-olds killing each other. Like all of that hope massacred on a stupid field. And anyone reasonable with children would say only old men should fight wars. It will be a very creaky war. It will take a lot of time. They don't need a lot of bathroom breaks. But that would be far more just, right? And why? Now, but it wouldn't be rational. The reason that like calculating killers send young people off to war is they have the least vested income or social, wealth. And so you go send young people because we can get more young people. But everyone knows that's wrong because of the foolish wisdom of providence. And I think that that's what is funny is we get this idea that the problem with, dating in the internet age is like, it's irrational, it's stupid, it's silly. And you go, no, guys, let's be honest. Far stupider is like, I married my wife at the sock hop. You're like, okay, she wore like one poodle dress. And like, no, like in some ways the kids are right. If the idea is compatibility, but crushing our individuality, putting them into categories and then putting them up on the web so people can pick and choose and go like, we have a 95%, compatibility score. That's actually rational. It's just not human. And this is the other preview. And we don't even have enough time, so it's good because I don't want to accidentally spill the beans on this one. But it's actually far more anti-fragile for there to be elements of foolishness involved. Because anytime any human overplans stuff, it always does not work like we think. You want to know what's the most utilitarian mate choosing possibility you can do? Eugenics. How's that gone? And you think about it with like dogs, right? We've bred dogs, quote unquote, according to rationality. And what do we have now? We have dogs that their hips don't work and they can't breathe out of their noses. So actually, foolishness is the most rational way to proceed. Yeah. This and more if you come to our talks at the Benedictine Conference. One more time, Bud, what's its actual name and when is it?
Yeah, it's the Symposium on Transforming Culture. It's at Benedictine in Atchinson, Kansas. Yeah, you could. I think hotels are fairly affordable down there. It's going to be next weekend, so it's the big day is March 22nd. That's when most of the keynotes and the conversation. And I specifically mentioned the conversation because the sort of like
spillover
socializing that takes place around the different talks is wonderful.
Amen. Foolish rationality. This is the Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. We were talking about how you should head on down next week to the, say that's full name, Bud.
The Symposium on Transforming Culture.
Over at Benedictine College in Atchinson, Kansas. The big day, March 22nd, right?
Yeah, I think if you just go online, use your phone or computer, and just do an internet search for Benedictine College Symposium, you'll find all the information you need.
I absolutely think so as well. And I know that they would be happy to see you. Hopefully, if you're young, we've given you some pointers. And hopefully, if you have children that are getting ready to marry, we point out that, it's not all hope is lost. It's just hope is weird. I think that's one way to put it.
Yeah, I was kind of disappointed we ran out of time because I was really sparked by some of what you shared. And I wish I would have beat you to the line, ruin your life well.
Uh-huh.
I love it in this conversation because there's this real rational utilitarian calculus where it's like, oh, like children are going to be, they're going to be a drag on my time and they're going to cost so much money and everything. And so even so many of us who have families, and I'm not saying this judgmentally, just like the way things work out in life, it's like, well, we'll sort of like plan our parenthood, right? And then we read in the newspapers, if people still read newspapers, we read online that, there's so many folks who find themselves lonely and depressed and feeling socially isolated. And it's, these kinship networks, there's not really something like that rationally unfolds about them. They really are kind of a raucous, this network, this web of relationships that unfolds.
Yeah, but speaking of, I know this is out of the blue. Where was the first date you went on with Rachel?
This is funny. We fell in love on a youth group trip, but our first date was walking the Keystone Trail in Omaha, just like a biking trail. And it's actually where I later proposed to her.
You actually are romantic. You don't actually need the internet to help you out at all.
No, and I was wearing some pretty awesome wind pants when we went on that date.
So, did that make you more aerodynamic then, or no? I'm joking.
It was a fun day, and like I said, I later proposed there. The day of our engagement was quite the day. We got in a car accident. I was then going to take her to a baseball game, which proceeded to get rained out. But my mom helped me with a little reconnaissance and set up this table on the Keystone Trail where there was a whole proposal gift and everything.
Wow, I'm much lamer. I went into the place we were going to buy the ring because we knew the person that was there and they could get us a deal. And I had Robin choose it because I did not trust myself to choose a ring. And then I proposed to her in the parking lot in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So we're like the opposites of proposals. We're both multi-decade married couples, so
it worked out okay.
At any rate, yeah. But something that's always anti-fragile, how about we pray together?
If you're an early riser, you can pray the Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 4 a.m., followed by the Rosary, 4:30 with Mother Angelica. Later in the morning, though, we've got the daily Mass at 10:30 a.m., Rosary right before that at 10, and then in the evening, we do another rosary, 8:30, Father Groeschel. He's got a very peaceful voice.
Indeed. Much more peaceful. Well, you have a rather peaceful voice. I do not. But I'm supposed to wake people up in the morning, so it works out. If you want to make sure to do things in and around the Iowa Catholic Radio listening area, easy to find out what to do. Go to iowacatholicradio.com, hit events. You can do things like April 2nd, an evening with Father Mike Schmitz. That is our big 20-year celebration. You won't want to miss that. See all of the first Fridays that we have coming up, or the Iowa Catholic Radio Golf Classic, May 21st, that is coming up as well. Folks, this ministry is more than just the folks you hear behind the mics or the people behind the boards and behind the desks. It is your ministry as well, but none of it is possible unless you are able to donate your prayers, your volunteer time, and, of course, materially. Your donations make this ministry work, so please prayerfully in this time of Lent, think about donating to Iowa Catholic Radio. You can do that by calling 515-223-1150 or going to Iowa Catholic Radio safely and securely. Donating there, Bud. Wonderful episode. Looking forward to giving this talk at Benedictine coming up here soon.
Yeah, it will be a lot of fun. And even the drive time, we're just, belting out our favorite songs.
Yeah. And maybe if you guys pay for it, we'll record it. And it
That's
can be,
right.
Yeah. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good. We'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast.